A 10-year-old boy vanished without a trace on a quiet morning in 1955, and for decades afterward, the case was filed away as a simple child wandered off and couldn't be found. But the truth is far darker than that. New clues have uncovered years later point to the existence of a secretive community where children were stripped of their identities and held against their will. This was a fifth grader, and every adult directly tied to his disappearance was between 30 and 40 years old at the time. For years, most people believed Alexander had simply gotten lost, and there was no evidence of an abduction. I don't buy that, and I'm about to explain why. Down in the description there's a playlist of powerful survival stories. I truly believe you'll find them inspiring journeys of stepping out of the darkness and reclaiming who you are. Before we dive into this shocking case, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1955, Waynesville, North Carolina, was still a peaceful mountain town where life revolved around church, the family-owned general store, and the railroad tracks that cut straight through the center. Everyone knew everyone, kids played outside unsupervised, and families trusted the streets were safe enough for children to run free. In that world, the King family was well known. Robert King worked at the machine shop near the train depot, and Marjorie King sewed clothes for folks around town. Their two kids, 10-year-old Alexander and 6-year-old Beth, were an unusually close brother-sister pair. Alexander always held Beth's hand on the walk to the ball field after school, constantly watching out for his little sister whenever they were out. The morning Alexander disappeared started like any other. The weather was clear, the early train whistle echoed in the distance, and the King family was having breakfast before the kids left the house. But the moment they stepped outside, Beth sensed something slightly off. A strange blue Chevrolet Bel Air was parked in an area where unfamiliar cars rarely stopped, and a little farther away, a man was leaning against a streetlight, staring in the direction the children were walking. Alexander noticed too but didn't seem worried. He just squeezed Beth's hand and kept walking the familiar route to the ball field. When they reached the turn, Alexander told Beth to go on ahead because he wanted to check something in his pocket, nothing so unusual that Beth stopped, but enough to separate the siblings for a few minutes. That brief window was all it took. When Beth glanced back, she saw Alexander standing near the strange car, the man talking to him in a way that made Alexander look confused but not scared enough to run. A few seconds later, Alexander stepped closer to the car door, and the scene became blurry for little Beth, who was too young to understand what was happening. As Beth started walking toward them, the car suddenly pulled away, made a U-turn, and sped off toward the main road, leaving nothing but silence and no trace of Alexander. Unable to find her brother on the short stretch between home and the ball field, Beth ran home and told her mother. Marjorie and the neighbors immediately fanned out, searching the ball field, empty lots, friends' houses, and nearby trails. Robert rushed home after an urgent call and threw himself into the search, hoping Alexander had simply wandered off somewhere in town. But after nearly an hour, with no sign of the boy, panic replaced confusion. Even close neighbors hadn't seen Alexander pass by as usual. There was no indication he was still anywhere nearby. In that moment, Robert went back inside, picked up the rotary phone, and called the sheriff's office, the first time in his life he'd ever had to report a missing child. That call ended the last peaceful chapter of the King family's life and set off a chain of events none of them could have imagined. Immediately after Robert King's call, the Haywood County Sheriff's Office direct line logged a missing 10-year-old, a situation always treated with higher priority than any routine civil matter. The duty officer instantly contacted Sheriff Walter Briggs, a veteran who had handled many lost child cases for years and knew the first hours were often make or break. Briggs left his office and reached the King home as quickly as possible, bringing the standard missing juvenile forms and questionnaire. At the house, he began with the basics: full name Alexander King, age, approximate height and weight, distinguishing features, and the clothing he was last seen wearing. Then he had Robert and Marjorie recount the morning from the moment Alexander left the house. All the information went into the initial missing person report, while the duty desk relayed the details to patrol units around town. Briggs then carefully interviewed Beth, the last person to see Alexander. With the special caution used for young witnesses, he asked about locations, exact times, and what she directly observed, where the strange car was parked, where the man was standing, how Alexander reacted while talking to him. Beth didn't remember many details but stressed that Alexander let go of her hand and walked toward the car before disappearing from sight. That allowed Briggs to establish the last seen point, near the streetlight on the route from the King home to the ball field. After marking it on the town map, Briggs stepped outside for a quick scene survey. He examined the walkway, the distance from the streetlight to the main road, and where the car had likely been parked according to Beth. Given how short that distance was, Briggs realized that in just a few seconds of acceleration a vehicle could leave the neighborhood unnoticed and head out of Waynesville in multiple directions. Next, Briggs launched the initial search perimeter. Per procedure, it covered a 1-mile radius from Alexander's last seen point, vacant lots, forest trails, the ball field area, and part of the road leading uphill. Patrol units were assigned by direction. One team swept north toward the train depot, another checked east where most homes were, and the remaining team searched the entrances to Pisgah Forest. Meanwhile, Briggs returned to the mobile command post set up near the scene to build a preliminary timeline. He cross-referenced every time marker: when Alexander left home, when Beth separated from him, when Beth saw him near the man and the car, when she ran home to tell her mother. The gaps were calculated using the average walking speed of children. From there, Briggs created the likely abduction window, a short but sufficient period for the perpetrator to get Alexander out of the area. To tighten the timeline, Briggs sent deputies to canvass witnesses at the ball field, the nearby intersection, and the general store to see if anyone noticed the strange car leaving. All collected data flowed back to command with the goal of narrowing the window and determining the vehicle's direction of travel. This was critical for shaping the search strategy in the crucial early hours when the odds of recovery were highest. By the end of this phase, Briggs had completed the initial missing person file, established Alexander's exact last seen point, launched the nearby search grid, and built a preliminary timeline that would serve as the foundation for the entire investigation moving forward. Using the initial missing person file and the confirmed last seen point, Briggs moved to the next phase, gathering statements from anyone who might have seen Alexander or the strange car that morning. He sent deputies door to door along the streets around the King home, from the small corner grocery and the garage near the depot to every residence near the turnoff to the ball field. Every witness was asked the same set of questions: who they saw at what time, which direction they were moving, and anything else unusual that morning. Information came in quickly, but it immediately revealed complications. Not everyone remembered exact times, and several people described the same car slightly differently. One witness said they saw a blue car parked near the streetlight around 8:15 a.m., another claimed they saw it drive off near 8:30, but wasn't sure if a child was inside. The grocery store owner recalled Alexander and Beth walking past around 8:10, while a milkman vaguely remembered seeing a boy who looked like Alexander standing near the roadside around 8:20. These discrepancies created a broad 8:10, 8:30 window too wide to pinpoint the abduction moment. Briggs compiled every statement onto a temporary timeline board, marking each time point with its source and reliability score based on the witness's vantage point, how often they observed that area, and consistency in their account. He paid special attention to a woman who lived along Alexander's route. She was certain she saw both children together quite early, and did not see any car parked at that time, meaning the car likely arrived only minutes before Beth and Alexander separated. Conversely, the milkman's description closely matched Beth's, a boy standing near a man, though he couldn't positively identify the child's face because he only caught a quick glimpse while driving. This forced Briggs to weigh the reliability of each statement, since time inconsistencies could throw off predictions about the car's escape route. Briggs began converting reported times using real distances, how many minutes it took a 6-mission 10-year-old to walk from the King House to the last seen point, how long from there to the ball field, when locals typically left for the store. He used these objective measurements to adjust the times witnesses provided. A key realization came when he noticed many statements were accurate, but off by 3-5 minutes, either because household clocks weren't synchronized, or because daily routines affected memory of exact times. This allowed Briggs to shrink the incident window. He eliminated statements too far outside the plausible range or unrelated to the children's route. At the same time, he checked with the deputy covering the nearby intersection whether anyone saw the car leave the neighborhood in the relevant window. One witness reported seeing a car pull out around 8:25, heading toward the main road out of town, a statement that lined up with Beth's account of the disappearance. After filtering out unreliable details, Briggs constructed the first adjusted timeline, a shorter, far more consistent sequence. Alexander and Beth left home between 8:05, 8:10. The strange car appeared between 8:10, 8:18. Beth separated from Alexander around 8:15, 8:20. Alexander was seen near the car between 8:18, 8:22, and the car was observed leaving the area between 8:22, 8:26. From this timeline, Briggs identified the suspect window roughly 4-6 minutes during which the abduction most likely occurred. That window was short enough to explain why no one witnessed the actual event, yet long enough for a car to start up, turn around, and leave the neighborhood without drawing attention. This tight time frame became the critical foundation for the next phase of the investigation, giving Briggs a much clearer picture of what to look for and which direction the car most likely took when it left Waynesville. With the first adjusted timeline now established, Briggs shifted focus to a systematic sweep of the crime scene, starting with the route Alexander and Beth had walked that morning. Deputies were assigned to search every section of the road, checking shoulders, vacant lots, fences, bushes, and any spots where a vehicle could stop briefly without drawing attention. The search followed a vertical grid pattern, combining visual inspection with documentation of any suspicious traces. Roads leading to the edge of Pisgah Forest were prioritized because they allowed a vehicle to leave the residential area quickly. This was also the direction witnesses confirmed, seeing a car pass at a time that overlapped with the suspected window. As the search expanded closer to the forest edge, Briggs called in a tracking dog team to follow Alexander's scent. He provided the handlers with one of the boy's shirts from his bedroom as the source scent. The dogs started from the exact spot where Beth last saw Alexander and moved along the route toward the main road. They reacted strongly in an area near a vacant lot several dozen meters away, a location Briggs found logical because it was secluded enough for a car to stop unnoticed. Initial signs indicated Alexander had stood in that area for at least a few seconds, but as the dogs approached the main road, they lost the trail. This was exactly what Briggs feared. If Alexander had been taken by vehicle, losing the scent right at the roadway boundary perfectly matched an abduction scenario. While searching the vacant lot, the team discovered a small piece of blue fabric caught on a low branch. The color matched the description of the clothing Alexander was wearing that morning. Briggs immediately ordered the exact location documented, the scene photographed, the fabric recovered with metal forceps, and placed into an evidence bag. Although local forensic capabilities in 1955 were extremely limited, he still regarded it as critical evidence, at least for comparison with clothing the family could provide. Several deputies also found faint impressions in the soil nearby, indistinct but shaped like tire tracks. Some marks were broken due to soft dirt or grass cover, but they were sufficient for Briggs to flag the area as suspicious. He couldn't immediately determine tire type or vehicle model, but he recorded the spacing between the tracks for later comparison if a matching vehicle was located. Briggs ordered a scene diagram drawn with 3 key points: the spot where Beth stood when she last saw Alexander, the vacant lot where the dogs reacted strongly, and the location of the tire impressions. These 3 points formed an action triangle that helped him visualize the perpetrator's likely movements during the critical minutes. The search team continued expanding outward, now along the main road leaving town. Deputies checked both sides of the road, farm turnoffs, and rarely used stretches. Areas with thick bushes right at the shoulder were examined especially carefully, in case the perpetrator had stopped to open a door or dispose of something before continuing. Briggs also directed searches of culverts, grassy areas, and any spots that might retain lightweight evidence, such as scraps of paper, a handkerchief, or anything that could have fallen from Alexander or the suspect's vehicle. One deputy reported faint children's shoe prints in soft soil beside the main road, but Briggs evaluated them cautiously. The prints were not clear enough to confirm they belonged to Alexander, and the town had many children who could have passed through the area that day. Still, he documented the location to avoid overlooking a potentially useful detail. When the search radius was extended another mile, no additional direct evidence was found. Briggs concluded the perpetrator had likely left the area very quickly, leaving only scattered and hard-to-follow traces. Nevertheless, the blue fabric scrap and tire impressions provided a foundation for identifying the actual vehicle stopping point. Back at the temporary command post near the King House, Briggs and the team conducted a preliminary analysis of everything collected that day: locations of evidence finds, the tracking dog's behavior, the probable direction the vehicle fled, and the relevance of each clue. Areas already searched were marked in red on the map, suspicious points circled, and the main road highlighted as the fastest escape route. By the end of the day's search, Briggs had sketched an initial crime scene picture. Alexander was most likely taken out of town by vehicle immediately after separating from Beth, and the physical clues recovered at the Pisgah forest edge were the first confirmation that this was not a simple missing person case, but a deliberate act involving a vehicle and clear planning. Based on the physical evidence and the established timeline, Briggs shifted focus to identifying the strange man Beth had seen near the car. This was the most critical human piece of the puzzle at this stage. Briggs ordered deputies to screen the local resident list, using the preliminary description: white male, average build, approximately 30-45 years old, wearing a hat, and standing near a blue Chevrolet Bel Air. The criteria were not highly specific, but sufficient to filter out a number of individuals from the town's population and those frequently seen in the area in the mornings. Some residents reported having seen a strange man several times in the past week, often near the road leading to the ball field, but no one knew his name or where he lived. This led Briggs to lean toward the possibility that he was not a local resident, but someone passing through town. Briggs launched the first investigative avenue, screening seasonal workers, people staying temporarily at boarding houses, and anyone who had passed through Waynesville in the period before the incident. The list produced 3 noteworthy suspects, all partially matching Beth's description. Briggs immediately ordered alibi checks for all 3. The first suspect was a man who worked at a lumber mill on the edge of town. Although his appearance was fairly consistent, he had been at work all morning with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. More importantly, his vehicle was an old red pickup truck, completely inconsistent with the described blue car. Briggs removed him from the suspect list after just a few hours. The second suspect was a man from a neighboring county who had come to town to make deliveries. At one point he had parked near where Beth saw Alexander, but his vehicle was a light-duty truck, not a Chevrolet Bel Air. Additionally, he had signed delivery paperwork during the suspected time window, significantly reducing the likelihood of involvement. Briggs kept his name in the file because of his proximity to the scene, but did not elevate his suspicion level. The third suspect drew the most attention: a freelance worker who frequently passed through Waynesville but had no fixed address in town. Several witnesses said they had seen him stop near the streetlight pole a few days before the incident. Briggs went to the boarding house where the man had been staying, but he had checked out early the morning after the disappearance. A search of the room turned up nothing suspicious, and the landlord confirmed the man's vehicle was a small brown pickup, not matching the blue car description. Despite the suspicious timing of his departure, Briggs had to eliminate him due to lack of concrete evidence. When all 3 viable leads were successively ruled out, Briggs re-examined the witness statements. He carefully reviewed every description. The hat could be a detail easily mistaken, since wide-brimmed hats were extremely common among men in Waynesville at the time. The car described as blue might also be inaccurate, as morning light and different viewing angles could make a gray-blue, or even dark blue vehicle appear light blue. Briggs also had to account for the possibility that witnesses misremembered or only caught a glimpse, especially a child like Beth. This reduced the weight of the initial description compared to objective factors. He sent a deputy back to each witness for more specific details, but most could recall very little. The strange man could have been someone just passing through town that morning, and the blue car could have been any vehicle in the region during an era when light blue was a common Bel Air color. Briggs compiled all the data into a preliminary analysis. None of the verified individuals could be the perpetrator. All three had either mismatched vehicles or solid alibis. The witness description was insufficient for positive identification, and there was no indication a local resident carried out the abduction. This left Briggs back at square one. Although the investigative steps had narrowed the scope, there was no longer a clear suspect to pursue. The absence of direct witnesses combined with overly general descriptions forced Briggs to accept that the strange man avenue could not advance further for the time being. This was the moment he had to consider other directions, even though it meant the investigation would broaden without a specific focus, a risk that could make the case harder to control in the coming days. With the strange man lead temporarily stalled, Briggs shifted focus to the remaining element most likely to yield a clear clue: the blue Chevrolet Bel Air mentioned by multiple witnesses. Tracing a vehicle is often more effective than tracing a person because cars have license plates, registration records, and travel patterns that can be verified through numerous indirect community sources. Briggs contacted DMV offices in neighboring counties, Haywood, Jackson, Buncombe, and Swain, requesting lists of all early 1950s Chevrolet Bel Airs currently registered, especially those in light blue or gray blue. At that time there was no digital database, so all information had to come from paper records, making the process slow and labor-intensive. Still, within half a day Briggs had a fairly comprehensive list, more than 40 vehicles in the region that could match the initial description. The next step was cross-referencing actual colors. Briggs knew witness descriptions of car color could be unreliable due to lighting, viewing position, or distance. One witness called it light blue, another gray blue, and one even described it as dark blue. These discrepancies prevented him from using color as a precise elimination criterion. Therefore, he treated color only as reference data, and shifted primary focus to travel patterns and the likelihood of each vehicle being in the area. The morning Alexander disappeared. Briggs divided the list into two groups: vehicles owned by local residents and those owned by people from outside who might pass through town. He prioritized the second group because many witnesses said the car looked unfamiliar and was not regularly seen in Waynesville. From the DMV list, Briggs identified about 12 vehicles belonging to drivers who did not reside in Waynesville. He began contacting each owner to verify where they were around 8 a.m. that day. Some were traveling salesmen, some were workers commuting between counties, and a few were simply acquaintances of local residents visiting family. The investigation showed most owners had reasonable explanations. One was in Jackson at the time with 3 witnesses. Another was delivering goods to a different town, and the signed delivery schedule matched the suspected time window perfectly. However, 2 owners caught Briggs' attention because their movements were not clearly verified. The first claimed he was en route to Asheville but could provide no witnesses or documentation. What raised more suspicion was that the time he left home overlapped with the critical window. But when deputies inspected the actual car, the color was deep blue, and the interior did not resemble Beth's or other witnesses' descriptions at all. Additionally, the car showed no signs of unusual use, no fresh scratches, and no evidence of having been driven on dirt roads that morning. Briggs marked this individual as low probability, but did not fully eliminate him. The second drove a gray-blue Bel Air to visit relatives in the area. He stated he had stopped at a store in Waynesville that morning to buy something, coinciding with the time Alexander vanished. However, when Briggs checked the store, he received confirmation the man had only stopped for a few minutes and left before 8 a.m., significantly earlier than the suspected window. This allowed Briggs to remove him from the primary list, though he still noted the case because the car had been near the scene. As the list narrowed, Briggs had deputies check local garages for any Bel Airs brought in for repair or maintenance in the week before the incident. One garage owner reported servicing a strange blue Bel Air 2 days before Alexander disappeared, but the car belonged to a traveler from Georgia. The owner said the visitor left town the same day the car was repaired and headed south, with no indication of returning to Waynesville. Although Briggs did not completely rule out the possibility the person returned unannounced, he considered this the least likely lead since no witness described seeing an out-of-state plate. Briggs reviewed the list again, this time cross-referencing with freight transport records, postal service routes, and private vehicles known to travel through Waynesville. But no Bel Air on the list was clearly present in town during the exact suspected time frame. Conflicting witness details further complicated the filtering process. The car could have been a 1953 or 1954 Bel Air, models that commonly came in blue shades that changed tone depending on light. A witness standing far away might perceive the color as lighter than it was, or conversely, a witness close by might misremember because the car was moving quickly. Briggs concluded that witness data could not serve as an absolute identification criterion. By the end of the day, after the entire list had been reviewed and gradually eliminated, Briggs realized no vehicle perfectly matched the original description. No car satisfied all three factors simultaneously: color as described by witnesses, travel pattern consistent with the timeline, and lack of a solid alibi. This pushed the investigation into an especially difficult phase. The vehicle remained the most important clue, but failure to identify it meant Briggs could not trace its direction or owner. From an investigative standpoint, this was a lead with both high potential and high risk of going nowhere, and at the moment reality leaned toward the latter. The described details were too vague to produce concrete progress. Briggs had to conclude that the vehicle tracking direction had reached its temporary limit, and could not be pursued further without new data. For now, the case was once again without a clear subject, and Briggs needed to consider other possibilities to keep the investigation moving forward. After the investigation into locating the vehicle yielded no new progress, Briggs decided to return to the field and expand the search deeper into the edges of Pisgah Forest, where the tracking dogs had lost Alexander's scent. The inability to identify the vehicle forced Briggs to consider the possibility that the perpetrator had taken Alexander into the forest area before traveling farther, or had stopped at a concealed location the search team had not checked in the early days. He reorganized the search teams into small groups, each responsible for a specific section of terrain, starting from the trails leading from the clearing, where the piece of green cloth was found, all the way to the lesser-traveled paths deep inside the forest. Pisgah Forest has complex terrain, numerous unofficial paths, unmarked trails, and steep slopes hidden under thick layers of leaves, making it difficult to determine the route taken. Briggs requested topographic maps provided by the U.S. Forest Service, but when comparing them against the actual terrain, he realized there were discrepancies. Some old trails no longer existed, while new paths created by locals or wildlife had never been recorded. This led Briggs to suspect that the initial search team may have missed several key areas by relying too heavily on official maps. To reduce errors, he ordered remeasurement of distances from landmarks to the main road, and a survey of the boundary areas between residential zones and the forest, places where a vehicle could stop without drawing attention. He reasoned that if the perpetrator brought Alexander into the forest, they would choose narrow, concealed trails, then quickly turn the vehicle around and head back to the main roads. This fit with the tracking dogs losing the scent near the highway, but did not rule out the possibility the perpetrator had made an additional stop before leaving town. As the teams pushed deeper into the forest, Briggs re-examined areas previously marked as cleared. One deputy reported that the northern edge of the original search zone was so steep and overgrown, it had only received a cursory sweep on the first day. Briggs decided to return to that spot, as the rugged terrain could easily hide small pieces of evidence. The teams followed soft soil patches, checking for footprints or tire tracks buried under dry leaves. However, recent weather had altered the ground, causing any traces, if they existed, to fade. The search grew harder as the forest floor mixed animal tracks, old forestry vehicle marks, and footprints from prior searches. Briggs gathered the deputies and instructed them to remark every checked area, using symbols to indicate coverage level, visual scan only, tracked by dogs, probed with tools or sticks. When overlaying these layers, he discovered the thoroughly searched area covered only about 2/3 of the original plan. Recognizing this error, Briggs ordered the entire search map redrawn manually, dividing the zone into grid squares and assigning teams to each. Though time-consuming, this is the standard method in child disappearances near forests to prevent oversights. At this pace, Briggs hoped to uncover new evidence, or at least confirm the perpetrator did not linger long in the forest before leaving town. However, after hours of expanded searching with no significant finds, Briggs had to consider other possibilities. The perpetrator may have taken Alexander straight out of the area, without entering deep into the woods. The vehicle may have only crossed the forest boundary to mislead, or evidence exists, but is too small or buried by terrain changes. All these hypotheses increased the case's uncertainty. When the teams returned to the staging area at day's end, they reported the assigned grid fully gridded and searched, but nothing new was found beyond the known faint tire marks and a few undatable shoe prints. Briggs marked the completed sections on the map. The more he looked, the larger the blank zones. No clues appeared compared to areas with notable signals. This made him realize the chances of finding new evidence were dropping fast. Briggs knew that as time passed, natural traces vanished quickly, terrain shifted, and any useful evidence was easily erased by weather or human activity. Finding nothing new on the second day of expanded searching raised fears the case could slip into the dark zone, where what happened can no longer be determined through physical clues. Search tempo also slowed as personnel could not sustain peak intensity indefinitely, and volunteer civilians grew weary. Though the teams remained dutiful, they could not deny the odds of recovering useful evidence fell with each passing hour. Briggs logged all the day's data, and concluded that despite expanding the area and rechecking previously overlooked routes, the investigation had returned to a state of no clear direction. Field search efforts had reached their limit without producing any discovery strong enough to shift the investigation's course. The expanded search in Pisgah Forest, yielding no new traces, forced Briggs to shift expectations to community tips, and just as the volume of reports surged, the investigation began veering off its original track. The sheriff's office received steady calls from residents in multiple towns, and even other states, all claiming to have seen a boy resembling Alexander. A gas station attendant mentioned a boy in a green car. A woman in Asheville described a face matching the missing person flyer. A long-haul trucker reported a frightened-looking boy. People in South Carolina joined in with sightings. The stories kept coming, different places, different versions. Briggs created a receipt log to avoid drowning in the flood of information. Every tip was checked by comparing location, approximate time, and description details. Most conclusions were identical, nothing specifically tied to Alexander. Deputies spent hours driving to each reported site, interviewing witnesses, re-examining described locations, and returning empty-handed. Common physical traits among children the same age made mistaken identity easy, especially when seen briefly in crowded settings. Many descriptions repeated the same vague pattern: brown hair, thin build, sad eyes, features too generic for investigative value. Briggs had the report screened and categorized, feeling-based only, vehicle described but not matching, same time but wrong direction, unable to recontact witness. The chart showed noise tips vastly outnumbered credible ones. This forced a strategy change. Instead of sending teams to every sighting, he prioritized cases with specific details, license plate, unusual behavior, or consistent witness accounts. Such tips were extremely rare and were quickly ruled out. One deputy noted the public mood had shifted from helpful to instinctive. Any child vaguely resembling Alexander triggered a report. This created an atmosphere of both anxiety and chaos, and that chaos spilled into the investigation, as every new lead demanded verification, yet contributed nothing to narrowing the search. Briggs personally reviewed the most promising tips, but none connected logically to the established early crime scene evidence. Reported times rarely matched the timeline, travel directions lacked continuity, and no witness provided a clear vehicle description. In Briggs's assessment, the sheer volume of tips only blurred the path to the correct direction. Deputies were dispatched in multiple directions but returned with the same report, not Alexander. The constant repetition of this outcome left the team fatigued and without an anchor for the next step. Briggs compiled everything onto an analysis board: no increase in physical evidence, no new witnesses, vehicle unidentified, direction of travel unknown, and community reports, adding no developable element. The board clearly showed data fragmentation, lots of information but little value, many accounts but no weight, many open paths but none leading to a concrete conclusion. Briggs concluded the investigation had lost its footing. The early days had physical traces, a timeline, a vehicle description. Now there were only scattered emotional reports from unrelated areas. Search momentum was stretched thin by excess information, rather than focused on the core. At this point, Briggs had to acknowledge no viable investigative avenue remained. The case had officially reached a dead end, every search line deployed, every analytical angle tested, every information source failing initial screening. No single new fact was strong enough to change the situation, and everything collected in this phase reflected one reality only. Alexander's trail had vanished completely after his final moments in Waynesville. The flood of community noise, and the failure to recover any additional physical evidence throughout the expanded search phase, forced Briggs to conduct a full reassessment of the entire investigation process. Timelines, search area diagrams, witness lists, suspicious vehicle lists, and all deputy reports were laid side by side for one final comparison before concluding the active phase. Looking at everything collected during the critical early days, Briggs could not identify any logical chain that would justify continuing active investigation along a defined path. Physical evidence stopped at the green cloth scrap and faint tire marks, not attributable to any specific vehicle. Witness statements were inconsistent, especially regarding vehicle color and the strange man's appearance, providing no firm basis for suspect identification. Checks of Bel Air vehicles across multiple counties produced no perfect matches. Each either had a clear alibi or failed to meet all criteria of color, route and timing simultaneously. The gaps in the data prevented Briggs from building a complete hypothesis grounded in hard evidence. The Alexander King case no longer fell within active emergency investigation, as time, evidence, and witness reliability had all eroded to the point where a new breakthrough was unlikely. There were no signs the perpetrator or vehicle remained in the area. No reports carried sufficient credibility to pursue. No overlooked natural traces remained unchecked. The search map was filled with red marks, showing areas swept multiple times. The thick case notes revealed nothing beyond the absence of a central clue. Despite days of high-intensity, coordinated effort, no meaningful progress had been achieved. Briggs had reached the limit of what was possible with available resources and technology. Continuing to search without specific guidance would waste time and severely damage team morale. This final evaluation led Briggs to an unwelcome but unavoidable conclusion. The initial investigative phase, encompassing all search, sweep, interview, and verification activities, had hit its ceiling and could go no further. In the report submitted to the county office, Briggs wrote clearly, "No new physical evidence found to continue investigation. No specific suspect, direction of victim or related vehicle undetermined. Case temporarily transferred to cold case status pending new information." This report marked the moment Alexander King's disappearance ceased to be treated as an active case and became a waiting file, one not fully closed, but impossible to advance without fresh data. After making the decision, Briggs ordered all evidence and records gathered, the green cloth scrap, crime scene photos, copies of witness statements, site diagrams, search maps, tracking dog logs, road survey reports, verified Bel Air list, and notes on previously questioned individuals. Everything was placed in a dedicated evidence box, sealed, and archived in the sheriff's office, cold case storage, according to protocol for unsolved child disappearances. Briggs added a note stating the early days had maximized resources yet still failed to produce a lead to Alexander's whereabouts. The major limitation of child disappearances that hinge on the initial window when traces are fresh. Once that window closes without clear evidence, the case almost inevitably slips into prolonged ambiguity. The King family was informed by Briggs of the decision to suspend active investigation. It was the hardest conversation he had faced since the case began. Robert and Marjorie expressed deep disappointment and pain, but they understood Briggs could not expand further without new data. The family refused to give up hope. They continued searching on their own, visiting nearby towns, asking at gas stations, stores and markets, carrying Alexander's photo, and questioning anyone they met. But days of independent searching produced the same results Briggs had encountered. Many people claimed to have seen a boy who looked like that, but no one offered a specific sign or exact time. Nothing was strong enough to send back to the sheriff's office. Briggs logged everything but could not use any detail to reopen the case. The family's persistence, though admirable, created no breakthrough. For them, every day without news of Alexander prolonged the painful uncertainty. For Briggs, every day without new data only reinforced that the case had reached the limit of what the initial phase could achieve. When Alexander King's box was placed on the cold case shelf, it officially entered the quiet realm of unsolved cases, where all documents are preserved awaiting an unknown future moment, when a single powerful clue might finally shatter the silence. With no further leads to continue the investigation, Alexander King's file was moved to cold case status, and from that point on, what actually happened to him, in the moments after leaving Waynesville, could only be reconstructed years later, from Alexander's own memories. Although this truth did not appear in the case file at the time, the actual sequence of events, according to Alexander's later account, shows that the first minutes after being separated from Beth quickly became a point of no return. When the green car stopped near the streetlight, Alexander was called back by a voice that sounded familiar rather than threatening. He did not realize he was being targeted. The car door opened, and within seconds he was pulled into the back seat before he could react. The vehicle sped off immediately, leaving the old road and heading straight toward the main highway that connected Waynesville to the mountains in the west. From the back seat, Alexander watched the familiar houses recede, then disappear around a bend. He did not panic right away, but the rapid movement and the man's silence soon made the situation feel wrong. Instead of heading into the center of town, the car turned onto a side road that linked to the federal highway running along the foot of the mountains. It was a little used route that allowed the car to leave the area without drawing attention. Alexander could not gauge how much time passed, but he remembered the car driving continuously without stopping anywhere familiar. The scenery changed from residential houses to sparse forest, then to narrow roads barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. The car sometimes slowed to navigate potholes or steep inclines, then accelerated again, as if the man did not want to remain in the area a minute longer than necessary. The roads, Alexander later learned, were likely the back routes connecting Haywood County to the neighboring counties in Tennessee, full of trails and secondary roads that outsiders would find hard to navigate. This showed the perpetrator had a certain knowledge of the terrain, or had planned the route in advance. Once deeper into the mountainous forest, the journey became even less predictable. Alexander remembered many sharp, steep turns, thick forest appearing continuously on both sides, and sunlight dimmed by the surrounding trees. Each turn brought strong jolts under his feet, as though the car was traveling over poorly maintained dirt tracks. He did not know how far they had gone, or when they had crossed out of North Carolina. Sometimes the car stopped briefly. The man would get out for a few minutes before returning, and continuing the drive. Alexander thought these might be areas so far from Waynesville that he could no longer hear any familiar town sounds. At that age, he did not yet understand that the farther he was taken, the smaller his chances of being found became. However, his memories show the journey lasted hours rather than minutes, proving the man chose a long circuitous route to avoid pursuit. The final destination was a dirt road leading into an unmarked area with no houses, only tall trees covering the path. The car drove deep inside, and stopped in front of a cluster of crude wooden cabins completely isolated from any settlement. This location was later identified as being in Tennessee, in the hilly, remote region where isolated groups often set up camps. To Alexander at the time, it was a completely alien place with no sign of authorities or ordinary people. The man took him out of the car and handed him over to another group. They did not ask his real name, they immediately called him by a new one, as if his old identity had to be erased that very second. No one explained anything, and Alexander had no chance to react. He only remembered being led into a small wooden cabin, the door closing behind him, and from that moment understanding he was no longer allowed to leave the area. The community Alexander was brought into operated as a completely closed self-contained group, cut off from the outside world. Everyone followed a strict daily structure, and children were treated as collective property rather than belonging to any family. That is why Alexander's arrival did not attract special attention. He simply became another child, newly brought in. His real identity was erased by forcing him to use a different name, and any mention of his past was forbidden. He was required to participate in all group activities, never leave the community's boundaries, never interact with outsiders, and absolutely never ask about the world beyond. Stripping him of his real identity was not only a means of control but also aimed at eliminating any chance he could be recognized if seen. No one at Morning Star Fellowship ever told him why he had been brought there or when, if ever, he would be allowed to leave. From a child's perspective, everything happened so fast that the adult's intentions were impossible to grasp. One day began in Waynesville with familiar routines, and a few hours later, Alexander was sitting in a strange cabin, surrounded by people who considered themselves part of a community no one outside knew existed. In the first days, Alexander did not fully grasp how serious it was to be severed from his origins. However, being given a new name and forced to follow new rules gradually made him realize this place had no intention of ever letting him return. He was stripped of contact with the outside world and absorbed into an environment where every activity was controlled, every thought directed, and every trace of his past deliberately erased. The atmosphere at Morning Star Fellowship enveloped Alexander from the very first days, quickly making him understand that the place operated under a closed, clearly coercive system. The people living there were not a simple community, but a group that followed strict rules imposed by a core of adults in leadership roles. Those rules governed every aspect of life: waking hours, meal times, work hours, study hours, and mandatory spiritual activities that children had to attend. Any behavior considered contrary to the rules led to punishment, not necessarily severe, but enough for a 10-year-old boy to understand that obedience was the only way to avoid trouble. Alexander was given a new name and required to use it immediately. Everyone around him called him by that name, and absolutely no one mentioned or allowed him to mention his real one. This was the first step in stripping away his personal identity, turning him into an anonymous member of the group. The regular group sessions constantly repeated the idea that the outside world was unsafe, and that children should be grateful the community had taken them in. Alexander understood that any sign he missed his family, or wanted to leave, would be treated as a violation of the group's spirit. The daily routine began early in the morning. Children were woken at the same time, ate fixed portions, then were divided into groups for assigned work. Because of his small size and age, Alexander was put in the light labor group, cleaning living areas, carrying water, tidying kitchen items. The work itself was not heavy, but what made him feel suffocated was the constant feeling that every move he made was being watched. Children were not allowed to move alone. An adult always supervised the group. The supervision was not to help but to ensure no one left the designated area. The group's control was evident in rules forbidding contact with outsiders, forbidding anyone from going beyond the wooden cabins, and forbidding questions about the roads leading in or out. Whenever Alexander looked toward the edge of the living area, where faint paths disappeared into the forest, he was immediately called back to his task. Children were also restricted from talking freely with one another, especially about life before coming here. Alexander noticed the other children rarely spoke about their past, perhaps because they had been there too long, or had grown used to being forced to abandon old memories. This taught him that to survive, he had to observe without drawing attention to himself. Despite the tight control, Alexander quietly continued watching his surroundings. When sent to fetch water from the well to the kitchen, he tried to memorize the route, the number of steps from the well to the main house, the slope of the hill, the direction of morning sunlight on the path. When assigned to clean behind the cabins, he noted the back sides of the wooden buildings, the less frequented open spaces, and the low bushes that could hide someone if needed. Observing became second nature, not to rebel right away, but to build a mental map of where he was. The greatest asset Alexander managed to keep was not material evidence, but his ability to remember details. Every small trail, every sharp turn, every distinctively shaped large tree, he stored them all in his mind, even though he did not yet know if they would ever be useful. It was this ability that gradually helped him realize Morning Star Fellowship was not as completely isolated as the leaders claimed. There were ways out, they were simply tightly controlled. During group sessions, he also paid attention to how the adults talked about the area. Sometimes they mentioned the main road, the junction, or the path down to the creek, even if they never pointed out exact locations. These small pieces of information helped him piece together a broader mental picture of the terrain. He understood that the forest surrounded the settlement in a crescent shape, and that there were at least two directions a person on foot could take to leave the area without crossing the main cluster of cabins. The repetitive daily chores, paradoxically, became opportunities for observation and analysis. He regularly noted the distance from the children's sleeping area to the adults' living area, the times of day when supervision was slightly lighter, and he listened to adult conversations for more clues. Over many months he began to form a rough picture of the group's operations, which hours were busiest, when supervision shifts changed, and when no one was stationed near the trails leading into the forest. These pieces did not yet form a concrete plan, but they built a foundation for understanding how the community functioned. Morning Star Fellowship's control was so thorough that children had almost no private space. Still, Alexander found ways to notice things the leaders did not want children to see. He registered the distant sound of wagon wheels from time to time, proof there was another road connecting to the outside world. He saw old wheel ruts in the dry dirt. He learned to judge direction by how sunlight filtered through the trees at different times of day. Those details were incomplete, but they accumulated over time, showing him that Morning Star was not an inescapable maze. He only needed to wait for the right moment and find the right turn. For years, these observations were the only thing he could truly call his own, and they formed the critical foundation for understanding his prison well enough to know he was not completely buried in darkness. Constant observation in the controlled environment gradually made Alexander aware of contradictions between what Morning Star Fellowship leaders claimed and what he saw with his own eyes. The group always insisted that all the children had been brought here because of special circumstances, and that the outside world was no longer safe for them. Yet the way they forced children to abandon their real names, forbade questions about family, and only allowed new identities made Alexander start to question his own origins. He remembered having a different name, a different place, a different life, but whenever he tried to recall more clearly, he was immediately told to focus on work or group activities. Still, memories could not be completely erased, and the very gaps the community tried to fill with its rules only made the abnormality of his situation more obvious. The first clues came from adult conversations he overheard while working nearby. One morning, while cleaning the kitchen, he heard an older woman mention the kid from Carolina, only for a man to cut her off angrily and tell her not to bring up old matters. Alexander was standing a few meters away, unnoticed, but the word Carolina was enough to spark suspicion. Another time, while carrying water to the main house, he saw two men sorting through old items in a box. Among the clutter was a tiny torn piece of paper with faint light blue printing. The blurry shape of the letters reminded him of the type on notices or documents from the outside. One of the men quickly picked it up and put it away as if he did not want anyone else to see it. Alexander did not fully understand what it meant, but he realized something was being hidden. As he grew a little older, Alexander paid closer attention to what the leaders said and how they reacted to questions. When a child asked why they could not leave the compound, the answer was always "It's dangerous outside." When another child asked about their origins, they were told "The people outside abandoned you. This is your real family now." The adults' evasiveness and inconsistent explanations convinced Alexander more and more that he had not been brought here out of kindness as they claimed. Gradually, he began noticing place names casually mentioned in daily life. Adults sometimes referred to the slope below the creek, the stretch to the main road, the valley over the hill, or even the state line in conversations they thought children were not listening to. These fragments helped him build a more complete mental map of the surrounding area. He understood that Morning Star was not absolutely isolated. It was simply hidden in the forest and relied on the group's control to prevent contact with the outside. Beyond place names, Alexander also memorized events in the community, the periodic large gatherings, delivery days, times when leaders left and returned. A few times he saw adults carrying bags of goods that clearly did not come from within the community. This proved they had contact with the outside world, even though they deliberately hid it from the children. Such events strengthened his belief that the outside world was not exactly as they described. He began comparing his faint memories with his current reality. In his mind, fleeting images of Waynesville occasionally resurfaced, the sound of the train, the road to the ball field, Beth holding his hand, the house with morning light pouring through the window. Those memories did not disappear no matter how hard he tried to focus on the present. They became the foundation for his conviction that he belonged somewhere else, and that conviction drove him to learn more about his surroundings. His curiosity never showed outwardly, it lived only in his thoughts. He always maintained an obedient appearance to avoid attention, but whenever he had a chance to pass the boundary between the cabins and the forest, he carefully noted small environmental changes: wind direction, soil moisture, the sound of running water. These tiny details showed that the place he was in was just one point in a vast mountain system that could not be completely cut off. He began to realize a chance to escape might exist, however slim. Seeing the leaders leave the community on a schedule taught him that supervision was not always absolute. There were a few time windows during the day, when fewer adults were around the children's area, especially during work shift changes. In late afternoon, Noise from the main house quieted a little before the evening session began. He considered these factors and started connecting them into gaps in control. Although he had no concrete plan yet, these gaps were the first step toward imagining the possibility of leaving. In other accidental moments, Alexander also noticed the adults' anxiety about children running away. Sometimes they mentioned locking down the west side, or keeping a closer eye on the curious little ones. This confirmed that escape attempts had happened, or were a real fear, and that leaving was not impossible. Those casual remarks let him know that if other children had tried to get out, he would not be the first to think of it. Over time, as his awareness grew, and his suspicions were reinforced by real observations, Alexander began to form the idea that one day, he would have to leave this place. The longing for fragments of memory about his old home, and the feeling of not belonging here, made that idea increasingly clear. From the bits of information he had collected, he started thinking about creating an escape route, not immediately, but in the near future when he understood Morning Star Fellowship's operations and the weaknesses in their control system better. Everything he observed, remembered, and analyzed revolved around this secret goal, marking the shift in Alexander's mind, from passive acceptance to active resolve. Even though outwardly he still lived as an obedient child who followed every rule. Years of accumulated observations gradually revealed to Alexander that Morning Star Fellowship was no longer maintaining the same strict control as before. The leadership had begun dispersing their forces due to daily needs. The number of adults was decreasing with each cycle, and supervision of the children became noticeably looser at certain times of day. The long communal work sessions left many older members exhausted, while the younger ones had to take on more tasks, resulting in fewer people paying attention to what the children were doing. This weakening did not happen overnight, but it was enough for Alexander to realize that an escape opportunity, which had previously been virtually zero, now had a clearer shape. He quietly noted the days with the lowest supervision late afternoon, when most adults were focused on preparing evening activities, early morning before the shift change had fully assembled, and days of harsh weather when adults preferred staying inside the main building rather than standing guard. He memorized those time windows and linked them to the routes he believed could lead out of the community. When those factors aligned, an escape plan began to take shape. Alexander could not create an elaborate plan because any unusual behavior would be quickly noticed. He chose simplicity: leave during the moment of least attention, and follow the routes he had memorized over the years. What he needed most was not physical strength, but determination and thorough knowledge of the terrain. The right moment arrived one afternoon, when the community was dealing with a shortage of supplies, forcing the adults to concentrate on transporting goods from a more distant area back to the settlement. The internal coordination drastically reduced child supervision and created the gap Alexander had been waiting for. When he was assigned to clean the area behind the kitchen, the spot with the least traffic at that hour, he immediately took advantage of the supervisor's inattention. Alexander slipped away from the compound and walked quickly along a trail he had noticed had few footprints, but led toward the lower forest where the trees were sparser. No one noticed because everyone was busy, and his absence in the first few minutes went undetected. He knew that if the group discovered he was missing too soon, they could mobilize people to chase him down. Therefore, instead of running straight along a predictable route, Alexander took a winding path. He moved through low bushes, followed slopes downward, where thick layers of leaves covered his tracks, then circled back toward the southwest, the direction he believed would take him beyond Morning Star's boundaries. Only when he was far enough from the wooden buildings that he could no longer hear human voices did he begin to pick up speed. The journey out of the community was not a straight line but a series of forest segments with varying inclines. Alexander avoided areas that showed signs of frequent use, such as trails where grass was pushed to the sides or old wheel ruts. Instead, he chose natural paths created by animals or gaps between rows of trees, places that left little trace and were hard to track. Traveling through the forest for hours exhausted him, but he did not dare stop for long. He could hear the wind change as he climbed higher ground, the sound of small streams when he went lower, and used the sun's position to stay oriented. As evening approached and the temperature dropped, he felt the real danger of wandering alone in the woods, but turning back was impossible. Each step deeper into the world beyond Morning Star was a step away from a controlled life, and closer to hope, no matter how fragile. When the sky began to darken, Alexander saw the first sign of life outside, an old fence stretching through the forest. This fence could not belong to Morning Star, because the materials were completely different, and the construction style was unlike anything he had seen in the community. It was a signal that he was nearing a populated area. Following the fence line, he gradually heard the faint sound of vehicle engines in the distance. Few, but enough to confirm he had escaped the isolated zone. Alexander kept walking until he spotted a lone log cabin at the edge of the forest. Light from the windows showed someone was inside. He approached, exhausted and afraid. Appearing suddenly in an unfamiliar place could cause misunderstanding, but he had no other choice. The homeowner, a middle-aged man, was shocked to see a filthy, exhausted boy who could barely speak a complete sentence. He quickly realized something was seriously wrong, and brought the boy inside to rest, gave him water, and asked a few questions to assess the situation. Alexander too panicked to explain his identity or background clearly, conveyed through the fear in his eyes that this was not an ordinary case of a lost child. Recognizing the gravity, the man immediately decided to take him where he could receive official help. Without hesitation, he drove Alexander to Newport, the nearest town with appropriate authorities. When the car stopped in front of the Newport Police Department, Alexander stepped out exhausted but still conscious. This was the first time he had left Morning Star's control and come into contact again with law enforcement, a world he no longer clearly remembered, but somehow still felt familiar deep in his memory. The man walked him inside, handed him over to the duty officers, and briefly recounted how he had found the boy. The door closing behind Alexander felt like it marked the boundary between a life of captivity and a new reality he did not yet fully understand, but he sensed it was the first step towards something right. Alexander's arrival at the Newport Police Department, brought by a concerned citizen, placed him in the hands of the first people in decades who had the ability to determine his true identity. In the intake area, the duty officers immediately documented his physical and mental condition: extremely fatigued, clothes covered in mud, carrying no personal belongings, and unable to provide a full name in the usual way. When asked his name, Alexander repeated the one imposed by Morning Star Fellowship, but when pressed further he hesitated, making it clear he wasn't certain it was his real name. That hesitation told the officer this was not a simple lost child case. The man who brought him, though he knew nothing of the boy's background, emphasized that the child had appeared in the forest under strange circumstances, and displayed fear unlike a kid who had simply wandered off playing. Newport PD began the standard information gathering process: estimated age, height, distinguishing features and signs indicating he had lived under unusual conditions. Alexander tried to describe faint memories: a town, a road, the sound of trains, and a little girl named Beth. The memories were fragmented, and did not form a complete story, but they were enough for the duty officer to recognize this could be a very old missing person case, rather than a recent incident. Because Alexander appeared older than children typically reported missing in recent years, the officer proactively requested checks against older records as well. Long-term missing person files in the region were manually reviewed, and although they did not know Alexander's exact age, they looked for descriptions that matched his estimated age range. One file stood out immediately: the 1955 disappearance in North Carolina of a 10-year-old boy named Alexander King. The description: light brown hair, slender build, taller than average for his age at the time of disappearance, matched the young man standing in front of them in a striking way. Despite the huge age discrepancy, the physical similarities and facial characteristics suggested the boy taken into Morning Star years ago might be the same person who once shook the town of Waynesville. The officers began deeper verification by asking Alexander questions tied to details in the file: town name, relatives' names, house location, usual routes. Though he could not answer clearly, Alexander reacted strongly to the name Beth. He paused, looked at the floor, and moved his lips as if trying to resurrect a buried memory. That reaction convinced the officer they were on the right track. Subsequently, old scars on his knee and a faint birthmark on his left shoulder, features documented in the original missing person report, were examined and showed high correspondence. The officers understood this case exceeded the normal scope of Newport PD, as it involved a decades-old federal missing person case outside Tennessee jurisdiction. They immediately contacted the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, NCSBI, the agency that had originally handled serious disappearances and had access to the original Alexander King file. The call was escalated as urgent, accompanied by basic information, current physical description, reaction to relatives' names, and correspondence with the old file. Newport PD also reported that the boy had likely been held in long-term captivity, evidenced by his fearful response to strangers and limited ability to describe memories. While awaiting NCSBI's response, Newport PD continued to monitor Alexander in a non-pressuring way, allowing him to rest and providing water and food. He gradually relaxed, though wariness remained in his eyes. He observed everyone around him, this time with a mixture of anxiety and hope, a feeling foreign after years lived within a closed system. The atmosphere in the intake room was one of tense but positive anticipation. They might be on the verge of resolving one of the region's longest unsolved disappearances, while giving a victim missing for nearly 4 decades his true identity back. Once the information was sent, Newport PD knew the rest belonged to the state-level authorities, yet they continued trying to draw small details from Alexander. Not as interrogation, but to help him reconnect the broken memories he had been unable to recall for so long. Those fragments, however disjointed, were the vital bridge between the boy now standing in the Newport police station and the 10-year-old who vanished from Waynesville in 1955. By making contact with NCSBI, Newport PD completed the most critical step, discovering a match that could completely alter the fate of a case long considered buried by time. The information from Newport PD reached the North Carolina SBI quickly and triggered an immediate reaction within the agency, because a disappearance approaching 4 decades rarely produced any further credible leads. Upon receiving the preliminary report about a young man with multiple points of similarity to the missing boy Alexander King, SBI agents traveled to Newport without delay to take direct custody of the case. Their first action was not interrogation, but an overall assessment of Alexander's condition. The way he reacted to the new environment, his confusion when asked his real name, and his faint memories of Waynesville, strengthened the hypothesis that he may have been raised in long-term isolation. With such an old file, statements alone were insufficient. The strongest verification available was DNA testing. SBI explained the upcoming procedure to Alexander, and although he did not fully grasp its significance, he agreed because he sensed it was the step toward discovering who he really was. The agents collected DNA samples from his mouth and hair following strict protocol. The process was quick, but its weight far exceeded anything that could be written in a report. The samples were sealed, coded, and documented on site at Newport PD, in the presence of local officers. Meanwhile, another SBI team was tasked with locating any surviving relatives of Alexander. According to the 1955 file, his sister Beth King had been 6 years old at the time. The agents quickly located current civil records, showing Beth was still living in North Carolina. Contacting relatives in a decades-old missing person case always requires extreme care. SBI understood that sudden news could be devastating to a family that had lived with an unresolved void for nearly 40 years. Therefore, they approached Beth in person, rather than by phone. When SBI agents arrived at Beth's residence, She had no idea that her brother's disappearance was about to be brought up in a way no one could have predicted. In the initial conversation, they informed her that a man found in Tennessee might be connected to the 1955 case. They made no absolute claims, only stating they needed a biological relative's DNA sample for comparison. Beth, having long ago accepted the painful likelihood that Alexander was gone, still harbored a tiny ember of hope she scarcely admitted to herself. Upon hearing the news, her expression mixed shock, skepticism, and suppressed hope. She agreed to cooperate, without needing time to think. SBI collected a DNA sample from Beth, using the same procedure as with Alexander. She was clearly explained that the test would determine biological relationship, and whether the man in question was truly the child who vanished decades earlier. Beth's sample was coded with the matching case number, sealed according to regulation, and placed in the same evidence chain to prevent errors. After both samples were obtained, SBI prepared to transport them to the state laboratory in Raleigh, the facility, equipped to perform DNA analysis to the highest standards of the time. Transport required strict cold chain compliance and detailed step-by-step documentation. The two DNA samples were placed in specialized containers, secured with tamper-evident seals, and carried personally by an agent, rather than sent through regular channels to minimize risk of loss or damage. Upon arrival in Raleigh, lab technicians received the samples immediately and placed them on the priority list. Cases involving long-term missing children are always treated with special importance, and the staff understood this could be the turning point in a case left open far too long. The lab began analysis by extracting DNA from each sample separately. PCR was used to amplify the identifying segments, then genetic loci were compared between Alexander and Beth to determine the probability of sibling relationship. The analysis went beyond surface-level matches, examining the match rate at each marker to reach a conclusion with high accuracy. While the lab carried out the technical steps, SBI continued gathering supplementary evidence, re-examining 1955 photographs of Alexander, comparing facial progression, reviewing previously documented physical marks, and preparing questions to probe deeper memories, if the DNA results were positive. They also prepared contingency plans in case the man was not Alexander, though that possibility diminished with each observed similarity. Tension enveloped the entire team handling the case. A positive match would solve one of the state's longest-running disappearances. A negative result would leave an individual who had lived in isolation, still without answers about his origins. Regardless, the process could not be rushed. Every verification step had to be executed with absolute precision. With both samples delivered to the Raleigh lab and DNA analysis now underway, SBI completed the most critical preparation phase to determine whether the stranger who appeared in Newport was in fact Alexander King, the 10-year-old boy who disappeared from Waynesville on a morning in 1955. The DNA analysis process at the Raleigh lab was initiated immediately after the samples from Alexander and Beth were received, and from that moment, the entire resolution of the case hinged on the precision of each technical step. The technicians began by extracting DNA from both sealed oral swabs, then used polymerase chain reaction (PCR) to amplify the segments of DNA carrying distinctive genetic markers. This amplification provided them with sufficient material to compare each genetic locus between the two samples, a procedure requiring absolute meticulousness, as any deviation could distort the results. Once the genetic data was digitized and analyzed, the technicians proceeded to compare every marker between Alexander and Beth. For full siblings, they expected to see a high degree of matching at multiple key markers. After the system ran the automated comparison, the raw results displayed a striking match rate at the primary genetic positions. The technicians then performed manual verification to eliminate errors. Each marker was re-examined through 2 independent layers of analysis. It did not take long for the data to reveal an undeniable fact. Alexander's and Beth's samples matched within the threshold that confirms direct biological relationship. The results far exceeded the reliability required for a legal conclusion. Not merely a high probability, the matching markers followed the exact inheritance pattern standard for full siblings in the same family. There could no longer be any doubt the man found in Newport was Alexander King, the 10-year-old child who disappeared nearly 4 decades earlier. The lab immediately sent the official report to the SBI in both digital and hard copy form, clearly stating the confirming indices and final conclusion. Upon receiving the report, SBI representatives reviewed the entire file once more to ensure no anomalies required further clarification. Every piece of data was consistent: the DNA confirmation, the faint but vivid reactions to family names, and the physical characteristics that matched the 1955 description. Combining all evidence, the SBI made the decision to publicly declare the official identity of Alexander King. The announcement was prepared and sent first to Newport PD, who were temporarily caring for Alexander, to confirm that the person in their custody was not an unidentified individual, but the victim of a prolonged abduction and unlawful detention. Next, the SBI forwarded the conclusion to authorities in North Carolina to update the legal status of the case. Alexander King's file, which had languished for decades under missing cold case, was changed to recovered kidnapping survivor. This was a profoundly significant shift, not only legally but humanely, because it proved that the victim of a decades-long abduction had survived and been found after 38 years. Inside the SBI offices, the heavy atmosphere that had surrounded the case for so long gradually gave way to a mixture of solemnity and relief. Although it did not answer every question about the disappearance, the DNA result delivered something no one had thought possible after all this time: positive identification of the victim and restoration of a truth the 1955 investigation could never reach. The SBI prepared the official release documents, including internal announcements, reports to state-level authorities, and next-step guidance for Newport PD in handling Alexander's case. Many steps remained ahead, but confirming identity through DNA testing marked the biggest milestone since Alexander vanished from Waynesville. The gap in certainty no longer existed. The man who had lived in isolation at Morning Star was the same boy torn from his family in 1955. With the DNA conclusion confirmed, every legal file concerning Alexander King entered a new phase, laying the foundation for subsequent actions to restore the identity, rights, and truth he had lost for nearly half his life. The DNA result confirming Alexander's identity forced the SBI to shift the case status from a decades-old file to an active investigation. With the living victim now present, the 1955 kidnapping was officially reopened, triggering a complete review of old records, archived physical evidence, and leads that had been abandoned due to the technological and data limitations of the time. First, the SBI retrieved the original sealed case box from when it became a cold case. Briggs reports, search grids around Waynesville, Beth's statement, witness transcripts, photographs of the green cloth scrap, tire track collection records, and the list of screened Chevrolet Bel Airs. Though aged and from a less advanced investigative era, these documents retained critical reference value for comparison with Alexander's new statements. The modern team focused on two primary objectives: determining exactly what happened the day Alexander disappeared and tracing the Morning Star community he described. The SBI began with more in-depth interviews of Alexander, systematically confirming details he recalled about being taken, the route leaving Waynesville, travel duration, the layout of Morning Star, and the faces of key leaders. Although Alexander's memories were incomplete and sometimes overlapped due to decades of isolation, the core elements aligned remarkably with facts gathered in 1955. When he described being placed in a green vehicle, stopping at a clearing, then traveling winding dirt roads deep into the woods, investigators immediately cross-referenced Briggs' old maps. The spot where tracking dogs lost the scent, the clearing, the faint tire tracks, and the suspected direction suddenly connected in a new coherent pattern. The modern investigation also re-examined old physical evidence using technology unavailable in 1955. The green cloth fragment was reanalyzed via spectroscopy and fiber science. Although no DNA remained, the fiber structure suggested common children's fabric of that era, supporting the theory it came from Alexander's clothing or was transferred during the abduction. Tire track photographs were digitized and compared against modern databases of vintage tread patterns. While no specific vehicle could be identified, the pattern was consistent with certain early 1953, 1954 Bel Air models, matching that year's witness descriptions. Reviewing old statements, the SBI realized inconsistencies in reported vehicle color could stem from lighting, angle, or even repainting. This allowed them to reopen previously eliminated vehicles, as some had been dismissed based on subjective rather than technical assessments. Concurrently, the SBI coordinated with Tennessee agencies to verify the location of Morning Star Fellowship. Alexander's descriptions of terrain, number of log buildings, distance to the creek, forest travel time, and markers such as old fencing or distant vehicle sounds were plotted on Tennessee topographic maps. A special investigative unit from the Tennessee Department of Safety helped match these details against areas known to have hosted isolated groups between 1960 and 1980. Forest regions between Cock and Sevier counties emerged as the highest probability zones, matching Alexander's description and past records of unregistered small communities. Old Tennessee records of extremist religious groups and separatist settlements were also pulled. One late 1960s report mentioned a small group operating near the northern forest boundary, consistent with Alexander's recalled log cabin layout and communal lifestyle. Although not explicitly named Morning Star, the similarities were sufficient for the SBI to flag it for deeper pursuit. As new and old data were aligned, investigators began compiling lists of potential past suspects. They re-examined men seen near Waynesville in 1955, including the 3 individuals Briggs had considered, and added former residents of the suspected Morning Star area based on tax records, land sale logs, forestry notes, and reports of religious migration groups. The goal was not only to find the direct abductor, but also anyone who may have delivered Alexander to the community. Certain names appeared repeatedly in Tennessee files, insufficient for charges, but enough for further screening. Simultaneously, investigators compared Alexander's new statements against names in those Tennessee records. Though his recall was incomplete, certain syllables or pronunciations matched surnames or nicknames documented in the old files, creating additional links between Morning Star and individuals present in the area after the abduction. Reopening the case also required the SBI to address the inherent limitations of the original 1955 investigation. Briggs had done everything possible with 1950s technology, but inevitable gaps were now being filled by modern analytical capabilities. Details once considered minor, wind direction, the exact time witnesses heard an engine, or the roadside section showing tire marks, now became data points that could reconstruct the full route. With the SBI formally reactivating the investigation and collaborating across state lines with Tennessee, the Alexander King case, for the first time in 38 years, had a new direction grounded in solid evidence, direct victim testimony, and the ability to locate the site where he had been held. The data provided by Alexander combined with the suspected map coordinates of Morning Star Fellowship allowed the SBI to move into an expanded investigative phase focused on the group's operational history and individuals who may have participated in the 1955 abduction. Reviewing Tennessee records from the late 1950s through the 1970s revealed scattered mentions of Morning Star, forestry reports, unauthorized forest land use citations, and a few entries regarding unregistered residency. These documents described a small, isolated, self-sufficient community that minimized contact with locals, matching the environment Alexander described. From there, the FBI began building a list of core Morningstar members based on names repeatedly appearing in land dispute minutes, delinquent tax notices, or reports of unlawful gatherings. Some individuals on the list matched physical or vocal traits, Alexander recalled, in the adults who oversaw children. However, most of those names belonged to people now deceased or no longer in current residency systems, limiting deeper verification. Parallel to tracing members, the FBI cross-checked missing children cases from North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky between 1950 and 1970 to determine whether Morningstar was linked to other incidents. Several cases shared similarities: children vanishing without trace, witnesses reporting strange vehicles nearby, or children believed to have run away, but no direct evidence tied them to Morningstar. Still, the repeating pattern led investigators to suspect Alexander was not the only child brought into the community. To gain clarity, the FBI sought former residents, or anyone who had contact with isolated Tennessee forest communities decades earlier. A few witnesses vaguely recalled a reclusive group near Cock County, the area Alexander described as having forest trails, wells, and log homes, and stated the group included children of unknown family origin. One individual who had left a different nearby community reported that some groups of that era accepted children without any legal process in order to grow the flock, which aligned with how Morningstar treated Alexander, renaming him, forbidding mention of his past, and treating children as community property. These statements did not identify specific perpetrators, but helped the FBI solidify the view that Morningstar operated as an organized system, rather than the actions of a lone individual. When all information was compiled, the FBI categorized three groups of potential direct involvement: the person who took Alexander from Waynesville, the person who received him upon arrival at Morningstar, and the leadership responsible for maintaining his captivity. However, the passage of time remained the greatest obstacle. Many key figures had died, left the state, or vanished from records entirely. Additionally, most 1955 physical evidence had degraded or was insufficient for modern forensic comparison. Consequently, although the FBI could reconstruct the operational model and confirm Morningstar's illegal nature, criminal prosecution was deemed almost impossible. Ultimately, the expanded investigation report concluded that Morningstar most likely received Alexander shortly after he was removed from Waynesville. The community possessed a tight internal structure and operated semi-secretly, and while no clear evidence of additional victims existed, the operational pattern indicated a risk that the group had taken in children from multiple sources. Though unable to name the direct perpetrator, the investigation provided the clearest possible picture of how Alexander was brought into and kept within Morningstar, while completing the evidentiary basis to close the field investigation portion of the case. The completion of the expanded investigation marked the moment when the FBI proceeded to the final verification step, a controlled, in-person reunion between Alexander and Beth, designed to ensure psychological safety for both, while simultaneously finalizing the legal identification file. The meeting took place in a private SBI room with soft lighting, on-site psychological support staff, and identification documents ready for detailed comparison. Beth arrived first, carrying a small box containing her brother's old belongings, a metal badge their father had given him, a frayed handkerchief, and a photograph of Alexander at age 8. Years had passed, but she had kept these items as a way of preserving the presence of the brother who never came home. When Alexander entered, thin, eyes cautious, a natural reflex from decades of controlled living, Beth froze. Though time had completely transformed the face of the child she once knew, certain features still allowed recognition: the distinctive bright brown eyes and the slight tilt of his head whenever he observed someone. At first, Alexander only looked, not approaching. SBI specialists encouraged the process to unfold naturally, without forcing recognition. When Beth opened the box and placed the metal badge on the table, Alexander stared at it for several seconds, as if a buried memory from his years in Morningstar was resurfacing. He reached out and lightly touched it. His eyes suddenly changed, an instinctive reaction no test could replicate. Beth then mentioned details only the two siblings could know: the creaky front step at their house, the game Alexander used to play drawing train tracks with sticks in the yard, and the name of the neighbor's cat he used to be afraid of. These small memories made Alexander lower his head, press his lips together slightly, then nod, a natural, unprompted recognition response. Investigators recorded these reactions as behavioral identification evidence, combined with DNA and family artifacts. Next, the SBI compared distinctive physical marks: an old scar on his right knee, ear shape, slightly crooked nasal bridge, and cheekbone structure, all matched the 1955 case file descriptions and the old photos Beth brought. These were features impossible to fake and formed a critical part of the live identification process. After the meeting, the SBI compiled a comprehensive report clearly stating the identification results: DNA match, artifact match, memory response behavioral match, and physical mark match. With all this data, they officially confirmed that the man found in Newport was Alexander King, the person missing since 1955. Once identity was verified, the SBI updated Alexander's legal status. His missing person file was changed from missing cold case to recovered kidnapping survivor. Civil records were restored, including reactivation of his birth certificate, re-establishment of his legal name, and official recognition as a victim of long-term unlawful detention. This was not merely administrative, it was essential for protecting his future legal rights. When all data had been collected, cross-checked, and verified, the SBI issued the official conclusion of the disappearance case. Alexander King was abducted from Waynesville in 1955 and taken to the Morningstar Fellowship, where he was held for nearly 4 decades under a strict identity. This conclusion closed the core investigation, returning the truth that the King family and authorities had sought for decades, and marking one of the longest-running missing person cases resolved in North Carolina. After his identity was confirmed, and he successfully reunited with Beth, Alexander entered a phase no less difficult, reintegrating into 1993 society after nearly 40 years of isolation. The differences in era, pace of life, technology, and basic social rules frequently left him confused and overwhelmed. The SBI worked with psychologists to create a long-term support plan to help him adapt without becoming overloaded. In initial therapy sessions, specialists noted reflexes tied to Morningstar, avoiding direct eye contact, constantly scanning for exits, and strong reactions to sudden noises, normal for someone who lived under strict control and discipline. Sessions focused on helping him understand that the old rules no longer applied, and that his current environment posed no threat. Concurrently, the state's legal department assisted in restoring Alexander's civil identity. His legal records had been frozen since 1955, rendering him virtually non-existent in any administrative system. The restoration process included reissuing a birth certificate, assigning a new personal identification number, creating new medical records, and reinstating citizenship rights, complex but necessary for normal societal participation. Medically, doctors conducted a full examination to assess the impact of decades in isolation. Unbalanced nutrition, prolonged manual labor, and lack of medical care left characteristic marks: thin skin, lower limb bones showing excessive load, and mild vision impairment. Doctors established a long-term treatment plan, including nutritional recovery, physical therapy, and mental health monitoring. These medical findings were added to the investigative file as evidence of living conditions inside Morningstar. During therapy and regular talks with investigators, Alexander gradually provided additional clues he had previously been unable to articulate clearly. Small details: kitchen location within the community, seasonal routines, the direction of the sun when fetching water, sounds of wagons or engines echoing from the forest, were entered into the geographic information system. These pieces helped the SBI refine the reconstructed map of Morningstar's location, narrowing the suspected area in Cook County, and identifying forest sites likely used for wooden structures. Investigators combined this testimony with data collected from Tennessee for a final field verification, confirming forest paths Alexander described and eliminating unsuitable locations. Although Morningstar no longer existed and time had erased most physical traces, terrain models matched many of Alexander's memories, strengthening the overall file's accuracy. Once all data was verified, the SBI closed the field investigation portion, concluding that the Morningstar Group had operated in the Tennessee forest area during Alexander's captivity and possessed sufficient organization to maintain long-term isolation. With field surveys complete and Alexander's basic identity restored, the post-reunion phase shifted focus to personal support, helping him reclaim the rhythm of life time had stolen and laying the foundation for a new life that was safer, clearer, and fully protected by law. Although modern investigation reconstructed most of Alexander's journey and confirmed Morningstar's role in his captivity, many critical questions remain forever unanswered. The biggest is the identity of the man who directly abducted Alexander from Waynesville in 1955. Though Alexander recalled a middle-aged man with a deep voice, dark hat, and green car, the memory had faded over time and was insufficient for comparison with any suspect in the files. The only eyewitness, Beth, saw only a fleeting silhouette and could not provide positive identification. Authorities in 1955 never obtained a license plate or further detailed description, leaving no basis to pursue the original perpetrator after nearly 4 decades. Similarly, the list of Morningstar members recorded by Tennessee is fragmented. Some names match Alexander's recollections, but many of those individuals are deceased, missing, or long gone from the area, making statements impossible to obtain. The group's closed, unregistered, and frequently mobile nature means almost no administrative records exist, creating decades-long information gaps. Thus, while investigators could reconstruct the group's lifestyle and control system, they could not determine who decided to take Alexander in, or who was responsible for keeping him captive. Another unknown is whether Morningstar was linked to other disappearances from the same era. Although the SBI cross-referenced numerous missing child cases from the 1950s through the 1970s, no evidence was strong enough to confirm or fully rule out connections. Cases with similar patterns, children vanishing without trace, no physical evidence, suspected removal to remote mountainous areas, suggest the group may have taken children from multiple sources, but there is zero confirmation from anyone inside the group. Children were renamed, stripped of family memories, and raised in isolation, making tracing origins nearly impossible. Even if some children later left as adults, their memories are unlikely to remain intact enough to serve as testimony. The scarcity of physical evidence also prevents full resolution. The green cloth scrap, tire tracks, and 1955 investigative notes are almost all that remain, but most evidence has deteriorated and cannot be analyzed with modern technology in a way that would trace the perpetrator. Much of Tennessee's Morningstar data was lost during administrative transitions and is unrecoverable. The community itself abandoned its former site years ago, and nature has erased nearly all physical signs, so field surveys yield no new leads. For these reasons, vast time gap, absent or deceased witnesses, eroded evidence, the Alexander King case, though the victim and captivity journey are established, can never be fully closed. Legal justice against the direct perpetrator and Morningstar's leaders will never be served. Authorities can only document the true nature of the crime, release verifiable truths, and accept that the rest will remain an unfillable void. The fact that Alexander King's file could not be completely closed underscores a crucial reality. The severe limitations of 1950s investigations created gaps that even modern technology cannot always fill. This case clearly reflects how fragile missing child searches were in an era without national databases, standardized evidence collection protocols, or forensic tools. A single oversight back then, not recording the license plate of a strange car circling the area, or not collecting fiber samples from Alexander's clothing, permanently constrained the investigation to guesswork. Lack of technology, procedures and interstate coordination caused cases like this to go cold far faster than we can imagine today. Yet it is precisely from those shortcomings that the role of forensics and DNA in cold cases becomes more vital than ever. In Alexander's case, what brought the truth back was not witnesses or physical items, but a tiny cell sample taken from the inside of his cheek, a technology that did not exist in 1955. Just a few hours of DNA analysis in Raleigh shattered 38 years of uncertainty, something the entire town, family, and original investigators could not achieve despite their best efforts. Modern forensics is not merely a case-breaking tool, it is the bridge between lost time and recovered truth. It proves no case is too old, if information is properly preserved and given to science. However, DNA can only work when records are maintained. Briggs's simple file box became priceless when the case was reopened. Had the cloth scrap, tire track photos, and Beth's statement not been carefully kept, modern investigators would have had no starting point to match Alexander's account. This is a major lesson for every justice system. Archiving is not just bureaucracy, it is an act of preserving the possibility of future truth. Every document, every scrap of evidence, every photograph, no matter how small, can become the key when technology advances. The greatest meaning of Alexander's story lies not only in the fact that he was found, but in the hope it offers thousands of American families still awaiting answers for missing loved ones. That a child separated from his family for nearly 4 decades could still have his identity confirmed through modern technology shows that time does not always bury the truth. This story sends a message to missing persons' families that their cases can come back to life at any moment, when science is strong enough, when a new witness appears, or when one small detail resurfaces. Justice may arrive late, but that does not diminish its value. On the contrary, the delay highlights the power of persistence from Briggs, who kept the file intact, from Beth, who never gave up hope, to the modern investigators who painstakingly reconstructed Alexander's memories. Persistence is not just the means to find victims, it is the declaration that every life is worth searching for, and every truth deserves to see the light. And finally, Alexander's story reminds us that justice does not always come in the form of prosecution or sentencing. Sometimes justice is simply returning a name to someone who was stripped of identity, returning truth to a family that lived in pain and uncertainty, and returning a voice to a victim forced into silence. In the world of cold cases, what matters is not that every question is answered, but that people never stop searching for the answers, until the moment the truth finally steps out of the darkness. In today's United States, the Alexander King story is not just a strange case from the past, it is a very modern reminder of how we protect children, trust science, and refuse to abandon those lost to the system. In 1955, Waynesville was a peaceful town, where people believed kids could walk alone to the ball field without danger, and that very imagined safety gave a stranger in a green Bel Air the chance to take Alexander and make him vanish. Today, America still has Morning Star fellowships, in different forms, extremist cults, reclusive groups, human trafficking rings, environments that isolate children from family and society. The lesson is that community vigilance is never excessive when you see a child with an adult who doesn't seem right, a strange car lingering near a playground, or a closed group like Morning Star controlling members' identities. That's the moment to ask questions and alert authorities. The story also shows the power of preservation and persistence. If Sheriff Briggs hadn't carefully filed the green cloth scrap, tire tracks and Beth's statement, if Beth hadn't kept her brother's little badge, then when the Raleigh lab ran PCR, And when Alexander saw that item, we could never have connected past to present. In today's America, that translates to parents keeping documents, photos, and identifying records of their children, agencies investing in cold case units and evidence storage, citizens supporting funding for forensic science and DNA databases. Finally, Beth's persistence, from a 6-year-old girl to a middle-aged woman still willing to give a DNA sample and face old pain, reminds us that in a society, sometimes too fast and too weary of bad news, hope is not a luxury, it is a responsibility. Never give up on the missing, never let go of stories without answers, and believe that justice, even when late, is still worth waiting and fighting for. Thank you for joining the journey to recover Alexander King's truth. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more cases solved after decades. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the power of hope and justice in disappearances that once seemed hopeless.